Picture this. It's a sunny morning in Rome, 855 AD. The Pope is riding through the streets in a grand procession, waving to adoring crowds, when suddenly he collapses. The papal robes are thrown back, and there, in front of thousands of shocked onlookers, the Pope gives birth to a baby. The secret is out. The head of the Catholic Church isn't a man at all. She's a woman who's been disguising herself for years, and she's just exposed herself in the most dramatic way possible. This is the legend of Pope Joan, and for over 400 years, people across Europe believed it actually happened. Her bust stood in cathedrals alongside other popes. Scholars cited her in theological debates. Reformers used her story to attack the Church. Even today, some people insist she was real and that the Vatican has simply covered up the evidence. But here's the twist. Pope Joan never existed. Not a shred of credible evidence supports her reign. Yet this completely fictional female pope became one of the most enduring and controversial legends of the Middle Ages. So how did a made-up story fool an entire continent for centuries? What does this myth tell us about medieval society, gender, and power? And why, even after being thoroughly debunked nearly 400 years ago, does the legend of Pope Joan still captivate us today? Let's dive into one of history's most audacious lies. The legend of Pope Joan didn't surface until 400 years after she supposedly reigned. The first mention came around 1250 AD from Dominican friar Jean de Mailly, who wrote of an unnamed woman becoming pope around 1100. Tellingly, he scribbled, "confirm," and "to be verified" in the margins, medieval shorthand for citation needed. The story that captured medieval imaginations came from Martin of Troppau later that century. He gave the tale specific details. Joan was born in Mainz to English parents and displayed exceptional intelligence. Desperate to study theology but barred as a woman, she disguised herself as a man named Johannes and traveled to Athens with her scholar lover. Her brilliant mind flourished, and she eventually rose through church ranks in Rome, from clerk to cardinal. When Pope Leo IV died in July 855, the cardinals unanimously elected her. She reigned for 2 years, 7 months, and 4 days, governing effectively while concealing her identity. Then disaster struck. During a papal procession between St. Peter's and the Lateran Palace, Joan went into labor and gave birth in the street. The deception exposed, she died shortly after. Martin claimed papal processions afterward avoided that cursed spot where the female pope had been revealed. Here's where the story becomes truly fascinating from a historical perspective. Throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, despite obvious contradictions between different versions, Pope Joan's existence was widely accepted as historical fact across Europe. The inconsistencies should have been glaring. Was Joan English or German? Was she born in Mainz or elsewhere? Was her real name Joan, Johanna, Agnes, Gilberta, Jutta, or Anna? Did she reign around 855 AD, 1087 AD, or 1100 AD? Did she die from childbirth complications, or was she murdered by an angry mob? Different sources gave wildly different answers to these basic questions, yet the tale appeared in increasingly prestigious contexts. The Italian humanist Giovanni Boccaccio included Pope Joan in his 14th century work concerning famous women, a collection of biographies of notable women throughout history. What's particularly revealing about this is that Boccaccio's compilation mixed mythological figures with historical ones. Egyptian goddesses appeared alongside Roman empresses, legendary Greek queens stood next to actual medieval noblewomen. Yet Pope Joan was presented as real as any of them. Perhaps most remarkably, the Siena Cathedral, completed in 1263 in the heart of Italy, featured a carved bust of Pope Joan among the sculptures of legitimate pontiffs. Her image stood alongside the authentic bishops of Rome, rendered in stone and honored in one of Italy's most magnificent churches. This wasn't some obscure rural chapel perpetuating local folklore. This was a major cathedral in the papal states themselves, the territories directly governed by the Pope, implicitly endorsing the legend as truth. The story even entered formal theological and legal discourse. During the Council of Constance in 1415, the reformer John Hus was put on trial for heresy. Among his arguments defending his positions, Hus cited Pope Joan as evidence that the Catholic Church and the papacy were not infallible. If a woman could deceive the entire church hierarchy, rise to the papacy, and reign for over 2 years without anyone discovering the truth, Hus argued, how could the church claim divine guidance and protection from error? Similarly, in 1391, during the heresy trial of Walter Brute in England, the defense invoked Pope Joan's existence to challenge papal authority. These weren't uneducated peasants spreading gossip around a village well. These were learned theologians in formal ecclesiastical courts, citing Pope Joan as established historical fact to make legal arguments about church doctrine. Dominican preachers regularly used the story of Pope Joan in their sermons as an exemplum, a cautionary tale about pride, deception, and the dangers of overreaching one's station. Books published in the Papal States with the implicit approval of church authorities included Pope Joan in lists of popes and discussed her reign as if it were as real as that of Gregory the Great or Leo the Great. Why did people believe it? To understand how intelligent, educated people could believe this story for so long, we need to understand the medieval relationship with historical sources and the broader cultural context of the time. Medieval chroniclers operated very differently from modern historians. They frequently recorded stories they'd heard through oral tradition or from other written sources without the rigorous verification we expect today. Moreover, medieval people had extremely limited ability to fact-check historical claims, especially about events centuries in the past. There was no internet, no centralized archives accessible to scholars, no easy way to consult original documents from distant times and places. If a respected Dominican friar wrote something in a chronicle and other chroniclers repeated it, and subsequent authors cited it, and the story didn't obviously contradict people's direct experience or deeply held beliefs, why wouldn't they accept it as true? The infrastructure for historical verification simply didn't exist. A scholar in Paris in 1350 who wanted to verify whether a female pope had reigned in 855 would have had almost no way to do so. They couldn't travel to Rome to check Vatican archives. They couldn't compare multiple contemporary 9th century sources. They had to rely on the chronicles available to them, which by the 14th century nearly all included Pope Joan because they were copying from Martin of Troppau or similar sources. The story also resonated powerfully with medieval anxieties, fascinations, and narrative traditions. The Middle Ages had a deeply complex and often contradictory relationship with women in religious life. On one hand, women saints, mystics, and abbesses wielded considerable spiritual authority. Catherine of Siena advised popes. Hildegard of Bingen corresponded with emperors and church leaders. Powerful abbesses ruled over double monasteries containing both monks and nuns. On the other hand, women were systematically excluded from the formal church hierarchy and viewed with suspicion when they claimed theological expertise or teaching authority. The idea that a woman could possess the intellectual capabilities to become pope was simultaneously fascinating and threatening to medieval audiences. Pope Joan embodied multiple narrative archetypes that appeared throughout medieval literature. There was the disguised woman, a common trope in everything from romances to saints' lives. There was the brilliant mind denied opportunity, which resonated with the growing number of educated women in the late Middle Ages who chafed against their limited options. There was the secret that cannot remain hidden, a favorite theme in medieval storytelling. And there was the catastrophic exposure of deception, which satisfied medieval audiences' love of dramatic reversals and moral lessons. The story also played directly into medieval concerns about corruption and worldliness in the papacy. The 10th and 11th centuries saw what historians call the saeculum obscurum, the dark age of the papacy, when popes were frequently appointed through political intrigue, bribery, violence, and family connections, rather than spiritual merit. Pope John XX, who reigned from 955 to 964, was notorious for his debauchery. Contemporary chronicles accused him of turning the Lateran Palace into a brothel, of gambling with church funds, of invoking pagan gods while drinking, and of ordaining a 10-year-old boy as bishop. He allegedly died of a stroke while in bed with a married woman, though some sources claim the woman's husband caught them and beat the Pope to death. Pope Benedict IX, who reigned 3 separate times in the 11th century, was accused of rape, murder, and other crimes. He allegedly sold the papacy to his godfather in 1045 so he could get married, though he later tried to reclaim the office. In this context, the idea that someone could deceive the church hierarchy and become pope through false pretenses didn't seem far-fetched at all. If popes could be murderers and fornicators, if they could buy and sell the papal office, if they could be controlled by powerful Roman families and their mistresses, why couldn't a woman have slipped through in disguise? Some historians have suggested that the legend of Pope Joan might have grown from confused or exaggerated accounts of powerful women who influenced the papacy. Marozia, a Roman noblewoman in the early 10th century, effectively controlled papal elections for years through her position as mistress to Pope Sergius III and mother to Pope John X. She and her mother Theodora were so powerful that some historians call this period the rule of the harlots. Perhaps stories about women wielding papal power were transformed over time and distance into the legend of a woman actually being pope. Or perhaps the tale arose from accounts of Pope John X's mistresses, who reportedly sat in on church councils and influenced papal decisions. Medieval people, playing a game of historical telephone over several centuries, could easily have distorted such stories into the legend we know. The careful debunking. The first serious challenges to Pope Joan's historicity emerged in the 16th century, driven by two major intellectual movements: the Renaissance's more critical approach to sources, and the Protestant Reformation's attacks on Catholic authority. Ironically, Protestants initially embraced and promoted the Pope Joan story as powerful propaganda against Rome. Martin Luther, John Calvin, and other reformers pointed to Joan as proof that the Catholic Church's claims of apostolic succession and divine guidance were false. If the Church could be so thoroughly deceived, if a woman could sit on Peter's throne for over 2 years without anyone noticing, how could Catholics claim that the Pope was Christ's vicar on earth, protected by the Holy Spirit from error? Protestant polemicists weaponized Pope Joan in pamphlets, sermons, and debates. They embellished the story further, adding details that made the Catholic Church look even more foolish and corrupt. Some Protestant versions claim that after Pope Joan's discovery, the Church instituted a humiliating ritual. Before any new pope was officially installed, he had to sit on a special chair with a hole in the seat while a cardinal reached underneath to physically verify that the pope-elect was male. This ritual never actually existed, but the story spread anyway. However, some scholars, both Catholic and Protestant, began asking uncomfortable questions as Renaissance humanism encouraged more critical analysis of historical sources. The French jurist Florimond de Raymond published work in the late 16th century expressing doubts about Pope Joan. The Italian friar Onofrio Panvino, writing around the same time, also questioned the legend and suggested alternative explanations. Panvino proposed that the Joan legend might have originated from confused stories about Marozia and the powerful women who dominated the papacy in the 10th century, or perhaps from accounts of Pope John XIII's scandalous behavior with his mistresses. These were plausible theories that attempted to find the grain of truth that might have sparked the legend. But the most comprehensive and devastating debunking came from David Blondel, a Calvinist scholar and minister who published Familiar Enlightenment of the Question: Whether a Woman Has Been Seated on the Papal Throne in Rome in 1647. Despite being a Protestant, and therefore having every reason to want the Pope Joan story to be true since it embarrassed Catholics, Blondel approached the question with remarkable scholarly rigor. He examined manuscripts carefully, compared different versions of chronicles, analyzed the timeline of papal succession, and looked for contemporary 9th century sources that might mention such a scandalous event. His findings systematically dismantled every aspect of the legend. First, Blondel highlighted the 400-year gap between Joan's supposed reign in 855 and the first written mention of her in the 1250s. This silence was deafening. Medieval chroniclers loved recording scandals and unusual events. They wrote extensively about far less dramatic papal controversies, disputed elections, and moral failings. Why would every single contemporary source from the 9th century fail to mention something as extraordinary as a female pope giving birth in public? Second, when Blondel examined the papal succession carefully using multiple contemporary sources from the 9th century, he found absolutely no gap where Joan could fit. Pope Leo IV died on July 17, 855 AD. Contemporary annals, letters, and church records document this clearly. By late September of the same year, Benedict III had been elected and consecrated as pope. The transition is well documented in sources written at the time, including letters from the Frankish emperor and chronicles from monasteries across Europe. There simply wasn't time for Joan's alleged reign of 2 years, 7 months, and 4 days. More importantly, none of these contemporary 9th century sources mention any controversy, any unusual circumstances, any gap in succession, or anything out of the ordinary. They describe a routine papal transition following Leo IV's death from illness. Furthermore, both Leo IV and Benedict III left extensive documentation of their reigns: papal bulls, letters, administrative records, accounts of church councils they presided over. These documents have been preserved and studied. There's no mysterious gap in papal documentation, no period where records suddenly stop or become suspicious. Blondel also pointed out the logical and practical problems with the story itself. How could Joan have hidden a pregnancy in its late stages? While papal vestments were certainly elaborate and voluminous, they weren't so concealing that a woman 9 months pregnant could completely hide her condition, especially from the many servants, attendants, and officials who would have close daily contact with the Pope. How could Joan have gone into labor and delivered a baby so quickly during a public procession that she didn't even have time to call for help or seek privacy? Childbirth, especially a first birth, typically takes hours. Why would Joan have participated in a public procession at all if she was days or weeks away from giving birth? Why, if this shocking event really happened, would papal processions simply avoid one street? Wouldn't there be monuments, commemorations, changes to church law, theological debates about what it meant, extensive documentation of how the church dealt with such an unprecedented crisis. Instead, according to the legend, everyone just quietly agreed to avoid one street and never talk about it until 400 years later. By the time Blondel published his thorough analysis in 1647, the Catholic Church had already begun officially distancing itself from the legend. Pope Clement VIII had removed Joan from official lists of pontiffs earlier in the century. In 1600, the bust of Pope Joan at Siena Cathedral was quietly altered and repurposed, transformed into a sculpture of Pope Zacharias, a legitimate 8th century pontiff. The Church's official position became clear. Pope Joan was a legend, a myth, a story that had unfortunately been believed for too long, but which careful scholarship had now debunked. And despite some lingering Protestant arguments, most scholars across Europe, both Catholic and Protestant, came to accept Blondel's evidence and conclusions. The myth that won't die. Despite being thoroughly debunked nearly 400 years ago, Pope Joan refuses to disappear. The legend continues to appear in novels, films, plays, and television shows, captivating new audiences in each generation. Donna Woolfolk-Cross's 1996 novel Pope Joan became an international bestseller, spawning translations into dozens of languages. The book presented Joan as a brilliant woman fighting against patriarchal oppression, using her intellect and determination to overcome the obstacles medieval society placed in her path. Cross's Joan is sympathetic, admirable, and tragic. In 2009, the German film Die Päpstin, released in English as Pope Joan, offered a lavish historical drama presenting the legend as if it were true. The film earned mixed reviews, but found an audience eager for stories about women defying gender restrictions and achieving greatness despite societal constraints. Some people today genuinely believe Pope Joan existed, arguing that the Catholic Church systematically erased her from history to hide an embarrassing truth. This argument ex silentio, as historians call it, suggests that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. According to this theory, the Church destroyed all contemporary records of Joan's papacy, which explains why we can't find any 9th century sources mentioning her. This conspiracy theory has problems. First, it would have required an impossibly coordinated effort. To erase Joan from history, the Church would have had to track down and destroy every single copy of every chronicle, letter, administrative record, and document from the 9th century that mentioned her across hundreds of monasteries, libraries, and archives spread throughout Europe. They would have had to do this so thoroughly that not a single contemporary mention survived anywhere. Moreover, if the Church was so committed to hiding Joan's existence, why did they allow the legend to persist for centuries? Why did papal territories publish books mentioning her? Why did Siena Cathedral feature her bust for over 300 years? If there was a cover-up, it was remarkably ineffective. The historical evidence overwhelmingly indicates that Pope Joan is a myth, a medieval legend that took on a life of its own and was gradually accepted as fact through repetition and the limitations of medieval historical methods. What the legend reveals. So if Pope Joan never existed, why does she matter? Why spend time examining a myth that was debunked centuries ago? Because myths matter, perhaps even more than historical facts in some ways. The French scholar Alain Bourreau, one of the foremost experts on the Pope Joan legend, calls her a symbolic object. What we believe about Pope Joan, or what we want to believe about her, reveals as much about us and our societies as it does about the Middle Ages. For medieval audiences, Pope Joan served multiple purposes. She was a cautionary tale about deception and pride. She was a scandal that confirmed suspicions about church corruption. She was proof that even the highest authorities could be fallible. She was an entertaining story, dramatic and shocking. For Protestant reformers in the 16th century, Joan proved Catholic claims of divine guidance were false. For modern feminists, she represents the talented woman denied opportunity by patriarchal structures, forced to hide her gender to achieve her potential. For conspiracy theorists, she embodies hidden truths that powerful institutions try to suppress. The story resonates because it touches on eternal themes: identity and disguise, ambition and limitation, gender and power, truth and deception, justice and punishment. These are the same themes that make Shakespeare's comedies work, the same tensions that drive contemporary debates about women in leadership positions, the same conflicts that appear throughout human storytelling. The Pope Joan legend also teaches us valuable lessons about how we consume and evaluate information. Medieval people believed the story partly because they lacked the tools to verify it properly, but also partly because it confirmed their existing beliefs and served their agendas. Different groups found the story useful for different purposes, which helped it spread and persist. We do exactly the same thing today. We're more likely to believe and share stories that confirm our existing worldview, that serve our political or social purposes, that make our opponents look bad or our side look good. We often don't fact-check things that feel true or that we want to be true. We repeat stories we've heard from sources we trust without verifying them ourselves. The medieval people who believed in Pope Joan weren't stupid or gullible. They were working with the information available to them, using the analytical tools they possessed, and making reasonable judgments based on their context. We're not fundamentally different. We just have better tools for verification now, which we don't always use as carefully as we should. The Winter Tale. The Pope Joan legend likely spread most effectively during the long winter months of the late Middle Ages, when people gathered indoors around fires, telling stories to pass the dark evenings. It had everything a good winter tale needed: drama, scandal, disguise, revelation, and a shocking twist ending. For those fortunate enough to be literate, reading about Pope Joan in chronicles or hearing about her in sermons provided entertainment alongside moral instruction. For the illiterate majority, hearing the story told and retold created a shared cultural knowledge, a common reference point that everyone understood. The legend became part of the fabric of medieval culture, as real to people as any historical fact, precisely because it was so often repeated, so widely believed, so useful for so many purposes. Truth and fiction blended together until they became indistinguishable. And perhaps that's the final lesson of Pope Joan. The stories we tell matter, whether they're true or not. They shape how we see the world, how we understand history, how we think about ourselves and each other. A fictional female pope influenced real theological debates, real political conflicts, and real cultural attitudes for centuries. Pope Joan never sat on the throne of St. Peter. She never gave birth in the streets of Rome. She never existed at all. But in some ways, that makes her story even more fascinating, because it means that medieval people created her, built her legend piece by piece, and believed in her so strongly that we're still talking about her over 700 years later. Whether huddled around winter fires in drafty medieval halls or scrolling through our phones in centrally heated apartments, humans have always loved a good story. And the tale of Pope Joan, scandalous, dramatic, and completely untrue, remains one of the best. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you want to see more content like this, be sure to subscribe.